Hello, friends. Welcome to today's talk on India's new growth model by the distinguished scholar Dr. Ezaz Ghani, former lead economist of the World Bank and senior fellow Pune International Center. I am Abhay Vaidya, Director PIC. Dr. Ghani is on a visit to India, and we are very happy to have it with us today. We also wish to welcome the chair for today's event, Dr. Niranjan Raj Adhyaksha, CEO and Senior Fellow, Earth India Research Advisors, and Professor Gurdas Nulkar, Trustee, Ecological Society of India. Dr. Niranjan Radhachaksha was previously Research Director at IDFC Institute and the Executive Editor of Mint, where he continues to write his Cafe Economics column. Niranjan is also a member of the Academic Advisory Board of the Meghnad Desai Academy of Economics and the Advisory Board of the Center for Civil Society. His research interests include macroeconomics, political economy, and economic history. Professor Gurudas Nulkar, the discussant on the panel today, is a teacher, researcher, and author. He has a PhD in environmental sustainability in industrial ecosystems and has been the postdoctoral Endeavour Fellow of the Government of Australia. He is also the Sir Ratan Tata Visiting Fellow at the Institute for Social and Economic Change, Bengaluru. Economic growth is fundamental to a nation's health, well-being, and prosperity. And the exciting talk today is on a new growth model for India. Our guest speaker, Dr. Ezaz Ghani, as I mentioned before, is the former lead economist at the World Bank. He has worked extensively on issues relating to Africa, East Asia, South Asia, corporate strategy, and independent evaluation unit. He is a prolific columnist and writes regularly on economic issues in a number of dailies such as Business Standard, Hindu, Financial Express, and Mint. Dr. Ghani has edited several books, including Reshaping Tomorrow, Is South Asia Ready for the Big League? The Poor Half Billion in South Asia, The Service Revolution in South Asia, Growth and Job Creation in South Asia. This discussion has a Q&A segment, and you are welcome to post your questions for our guest speaker and our panelists in the question box. Before handing over the floor to Niranjan, I would like to mention that Pune International Center is a think tank which works in the areas of national security, energy, environment and climate change, social innovation, science, technology, innovation and growth, and economic reforms and urbanization. We regularly hold discussions on current affairs, new books, and conversations with domain experts, and you are welcome to participate in these events. All the links to our events are posted on our website, puneinternationalcenter.org. With this brief introduction, I welcome you once again to this discussion. May I now request the chair to make his opening remarks. Dr. Niranjan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Abhay. First of all, it's an absolute pleasure to chair this session with Dr. Ghani speaking and presenting his paper. Like many others, I've been an avid reader of both his academic papers and his writing in newspapers, and almost inevitably learned a lot. I don't want to make too many opening or comments. Just that we very often think about the most immediate macroeconomics issues, right? Inflation, price of oil, the growth rate this quarter. Far less attention is paid to the longer term trajectory of the economy and the underlying growth model. And much of the academic work and policy work over the past 50 years has focused on a particular type of growth model, which is the growth model which East Asia and then China followed. And it's interesting that Dr. Ghani is today, I assume, he's going to take us through this entire thing about India's unique growth model and a sort of a new way of thinking about a long-term structural change in India and India's long march out of mass poverty. As I said, it's, I don't want to take too much time with opening remarks. The way this session, I hope, will go is that Dr. Ghani will first present his paper, about 25 to 30 minutes. Then I'll invite the discussant, Professor Nulkar, to give his comments for about 10 minutes. I'm sure Dr. Ghani will then want to respond to some of the comments which Professor Nulkar has made, so another 5 minutes. And then we can have the last 10 to 15 minutes for audience questions. And I may use the privilege of the chair to slip in a question or two of my own. So without taking any further time, I'd like to invite Dr. Ghani to present his work on India's new growth model.
Thank you, Dr. Niranjan. You have given a comprehensive big picture on the growth agenda, and it has motivated me enough so that I'm going to focus on very specific questions in this seminar. I have a list of questions. The topic India's new growth model raises a number of questions. And it's good to list out, some of the questions that I'm going to discuss today. And second page, I will go to second page. Yeah. Okay, so in this seminar, I'm going to focus on the following questions. What is so new about this growth model? So it's going to compare and see whether this is, in what way are we calling that India has a new growth model? And most of the evidence will be based on 30 years of growth experience of India from 1991 up to present. And it'll try to answer what is so new about this growth model. The second question that I'm going to ask is, what is behind the success of the new growth model? And what are the conditions that enabled India to achieve the new growth model? And then there are a number of related questions. We know that globalization can have a huge impact on any growth strategy of any country. And we'll ask the question, how has globalization impacted India's new growth model? Related to the new growth model agenda is also India's march in the global talent race. The CEO of Google is an Indian. A majority of people working in the Silicon Valley are from India. So we'll ask the question, how has the new global talent race impacted India's growth model? And then the current question, the world is facing a global economic downturn. What impact will this have on India's growth model, the new growth model? And much more, and the most important of all, is how inclusive is India's new growth model? And here we will provide data and evidence to answer the questions in terms of its contribution to poverty reduction, its contribution to job creation, etc. And finally, we'll end up with what will shape India's future growth in the next 10, 15 years, what needs to be done to sustain a high level of growth. So let me turn to the very first question. What is so new about this growth model of India? It's just not high level of growth that defines India's new growth model. Both China and India have maintained, very high growth. They have maintained some of the highest growth rates in the world for the last 3 decades. The difference is that while both China and India have achieved high growth rate, India has achieved it through a service-led growth, unlike China, where it has focused the growth was propelled by the manufacturing sector. So that's the key difference, that India has, India has achieved very high growth rates with the service sector taking the lead. And so clearly in any growth agenda, we start asking the question, is this growth, that path that India has followed, has it been associated with changes in labor productivity, total factor productivity, resource allocation, series of questions. So we examined this in detail using macro, micro data. And what is striking about India's new growth model is the huge increase in national labor productivity growth. India's total factor productivity growth rate in the service sector has increased at twice the rate compared to China and USA and other countries. India's productivity growth in services have also increased at a much faster pace compared to the productivity growth in the manufacturing sector.
Ijaz, I'm sorry, can I just Niranjan here, the slides are not moving ahead. Would you like to shift to the slideshow? Because a couple of people in the audience have also pointed that out.
Sorry? The slide yet. I'm still on the India's new growth.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
I will say.
These are, okay. Each question has a couple of bullet points, but behind the bullet points is a lot of evidence which I'm not able to put up, but it's up in the brain or in the book.
Yeah.
But I'm going to share it to back the statements being made in the PowerPoint. So I'm still on the second question, on the
Second slide.
first question, what is so new about the India's growth model? And here, India has followed a service-led growth, and the productivity growth in services have grown at twice the rate compared to manufacturing sector, and the increase in productivity growth in India has outpaced China and USA in the services sector. My last point in the India's new growth model slide is that a comparison of cross-country growth regressions in total labor productivity, service labor productivity, and industrial labor productivity confirms the miracle of service-led growth in India. We put together 100 countries, took 2 decades of growth data, looked at labor productivity, service productivity, industrial labor productivity, ran the regressions, and India's service labor productivity stood out, was an outlier on the upside in most of the cross-country regressions. So the India's new growth model breaks an iron law of development that has held for more than 200 years, that development is associated with a transition from agriculture, then into manufacturing, then into services. India made a big leap straight from agriculture into services. So the massive productivity growth in services in India, which is striking and greater than in USA and China, is not surprising, because the productivity growth in agriculture is so low, and when you jump straight into services, the productivity growth is high, then the rate of growth in the services sector is much higher. So it's this unusual path that India followed, which explains why India's productivity growth in services is greater than China and USA and other countries. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. And the next slide asks the question, so what enabled India to achieve the new growth model? So we'll try and pick up some of the factors that explains the transition India made into the new growth model. And to keep it simple, we call it the three T's: technology, transport, and trade. These three factors, technology, transport, and trade, have enabled rapid globalization of services. Technology, the internet, enables services to be traded just like goods. It can be transported through the internet just like goods are transported on the roads. And tradability relates to the demand, the export, import, and how the global trade in services have performed. They have enabled rapid globalization of services. Now, India's service-led growth resulted from a combination of factors, including market integration, improved availability of the quality of infrastructure, and availability of education and skilled labor force. Both the scalability, depth, and quality of the talent pool in India. The infrastructure for the service-led growth was enabled by wide practices in public-private partnerships that is common and widespread in IT and IT-enabled services. The evidence of the public-private partnership is there in the book, and the columns we can find out. The Indian diaspora abroad also played an important role in fostering the country's IT BPO industry. It provided the contacts and networks. We examined, the role of diaspora in Odesk. Odesk is a large company in USA. And the issue was that they were outsourcing everything. The Odesk was outsourcing everything to India. And we asked the question, is this corruption and nepotism, or is this, contributing to growth and productivity? And we found that the networking that the Indians had in Odesk in Silicon Valley in USA played a key role in outsourcing of the services to India, and it actually improved the profit margins of the company and reduced the cost. So there was no corruption in the networking. It actually enhanced the growth agenda. India has also experienced a telecom revolution. The sector has experienced major investments and competition, and this has improved electronic delivery of services tremendously. One thing to keep in mind is that India's education system is unique. It's unique in the sense that it spends 6 times more on tertiary education than on primary education. Now, this topic is to be debated. I mean, it's not always great to spend more on tertiary education and ignore the children, but I'm just putting forward the empirical facts we found, that India is spending a lot more on tertiary education, which explains why the IITs and the various universities, they made a big leap in this service revolution where India is so advanced. I'll move on to the next slide now. The next slide asks the question, how has globalization, or you may call it trade, impacted India's new growth model? What we found is that over the last 30 years, the trade in services have exploded at a much faster pace than trade in manufacturing. And the global trade in services, stand out as much larger and bigger than the manufacturing sector. This is, of course, good for India, because if the global service sector trade is so huge, there is greater potential for India to benefit from a service-led growth. We disaggregated the global service export into modern service export, computers and information services, financial services, etc., and traditional service such as travel, leisure, transport. And this data shows that over the last 30 years, India's export of modern services have grown much faster than traditional service exports. And there is increasing evidence that countries that specialize in the type of goods. I mean, one question we have to ask is why India, a developing country, when people struggle for food, should be specializing in highly skilled IT services? And the answer is, the Americans don't want the food, they want the digital services. That demand for digital services in Europe and USA has exploded. They're the rich people. So we are helping to meet their demand. And in order to meet their demand, we have started to specialize in the type of goods that rich countries, want, and they are likely to, export than the countries that specialize in low income countries. India's IT-enabled service exports have more in common with exports of USA and Europe. And India has an advantage in that, and I'll come to that later on, why India can compete better than USA and Europe in high-skilled jobs. The other aspect of how globalization has enabled India to grow is the networking and the spillover effects of modern service exports on domestic economy. That's also immense. We have seen this with the large diaspora of Indians in the Silicon Valley and the rest of the world. That spillover effects has helped the modern services sector to grow rapidly in India. And today, innovation and technological changes have made location, proximity, and time requirements that inhibited service transactions redundant. People work in night here and they connect with US and India. Distance doesn't matter. You can be in any part of India and connect with the Silicon Valley and do your business online. Technology has reduced the cost of trading services or the cost of transactions. Everyone now just goes online and puts in an order, and the services are provided, exchanged, and outsold. And the range of business processes, services that can be globalized and digitized is constantly expanding. I mean, in the next 10 years, I'll be thrilled to hear from the IT experts in this, where the new industry models are developing, where the new potential for growth remains in India. So I'll move on to so this partly explains how globalization has impacted India's new growth model. Let me move to the next question, which relates to the global talent race. In most of the discussions on globalization and trade, the focus is just on goods and services. How much did we export? How much did we import? Very little discussion is placed on, the role of migration, remittances, spillover effects of the large pool of Indians who are abroad and the role they play in propelling higher growth in India. I call this the global talent race. The explanation is simple. Technology is advancing rapidly, and there is demand for talent. It so happens that India has a huge youth bulge, young people, eager to learn, eager to march ahead. China, Europe, and USA has an aging population. So this has enabled India to make a big leap in the global talent race. India has the largest diaspora in the world with 20 million people living outside their homeland. I mentioned about the unique demographic advantage, the youth bulge in India. And currently and in future, a worldwide war for talent has started. And enterprises that manage their global talent pool are marching ahead. If we examine how has the composition of global migration evolved over time, globally we find that the share of high-skilled migrants relative to low-skilled migrants has grown exponentially, and India has benefited from this during the last decade. India is one of the pioneers in recognizing the importance of diaspora and meet the aspirations of the overseas Indian community as a significant constituency across the world. So the global talent race has helped the new growth model, and given that India's demographic and youth bulge will remain for another decade and population will age rapidly in Europe and USA, the global talent race is only going to help India and propel even higher growth rates in the new growth model. I'm going to go to the next question, which is how vulnerable is India's growth to the current global economic downturn? The coronavirus, the Ukraine agenda, the rise in inflation, this have created a bit of economic and financial shocks in the system. And there are rising concerns that growth in the future in India will be badly impacted by this. How badly will it be impacted, given that India's growth path is different? It's based on services, less on manufacturing. And we found that during previous global downturns, the decline in service trade was less volatile compared to the goods trade. So this is a good sign. India has relied much more on service trade, so which is less volatile during downturn. So this is a good sign that India's vulnerability is less. How will the financial turmoil impact India's service-led growth? Service exports, there is a fear that US is going to raise interest rates, and the raise in interest rates will result in huge depreciation of rupees, financial turmoil, outflow of capital. RBI will panic. And this agenda has already started, the concern about capital outflows and how will the macro agenda be managed when the Fed starts increasing the interest rates. The Fed will increase the interest rate this week. Now we found that the vulnerability of the service sector is less than the vulnerability of the goods trade. Goods exports and remittances are the largest source of external fund inflows into India. They are much less volatile compared to portfolio and FDI inflows. Portfolio and FDI inflows are highly volatile, but not service exports and remittances. There is now a consensus that the growth slowdown in the US, China, and Europe and other major economies is the result of supply bottlenecks in the goods market. On the other hand, the pandemic has opened many service sectors and linking them to the global supply chains. Let me move on to the next question. How inclusive is India's growth model? This question is important because the moment we start talking about, India's high-skilled service export, the big question is, how is it helping the poor people? I mean, any growth should result in poverty reduction, more job creation. And traditionally, we have favored manufacturing sector because manufacturing sector has been associated more with poverty reduction than services and job creation. Now we examined this question empirically. This was done along with the Harvard Business School colleagues. We looked at hard data. And the hard data showed that the service sector in India is more correlated to poverty reduction than growth in manufacturing sector. The growth in services sector in India have contributed a great deal more to poverty reduction than manufacturing. The data is available, on Google. Just type in, the topics that you're concerned with, and you will get and also in the paper that I've shared with the references are there. Service growth has reduced poverty through two channels. First, they have provided the largest source of job growth by creating more jobs. Services have contributed a lot more to job growth than manufacturing. If you create more jobs, it reduces poverty. Second, they provided the income effect, and that this income, when spent, drives further demand for goods and services and for the jobs to produce them. So both the static and dynamic effect, the new growth model of India has contributed more to poverty reduction. But this does not mean that everything is hunky-dory. I mean, India adds 10 million new workers in the labor force every year. And the amount of jobs being created in the service sector is simply not good enough to absorb the additional 10 million workers who are joining. So the rate of job creation in this new growth model or the old growth model has not kept up with the potential for labor mobility from agriculture to other sectors. It has failed to keep up with India's demographic dividends. India needs to create 200, as many jobs, nearly for 200 million more people who will enter the working age over the next decade and who will need jobs. So while the new growth model has been inclusive and services have contributed more to job growth and poverty reduction, the rate of economic growth needs to be scaled up to create more jobs given India's youth bulge and the number of people who join the labor force. So I'm going to move on to the next question. This raises the question, what will shape India's growth over the next one decade? And this is based on the empirical evidence on what drove India's growth in the last 2 decades, led by the services sector. There are 3 things policymakers will need to do. First, India will need to scale up investments in both physical and human infrastructure, without which enterprises cannot benefit from market integration, globalization, and trade. And one shouldn't be hesitant in scaling up investments in India's physical infrastructure and education, because our evidence shows that the rate of return on infrastructure projects in India are much higher compared to OECD countries, given the huge potential for growth in India. Second, policymakers need to reduce the digital divide that deprives nearly 500 million people from access to the internet, and the spatial digital divide, density between rural and urban areas, between gender, many more women don't have access to internet. These kind of digital divides across leading lagging states, across urban rural areas, across gender, is going to help India to propel growth much higher. Keep in mind that 50% of the population is women, and the women participation in the labor force is very low. And if one can scale up their job growth, economic growth is also going to skyrocket. Finally, the third thing the policymakers can do is firms and universities are currently at the frontline participation in the global talent race, but global governance organizations, multilateral development banks, and civil society groups also have a key role to play. I don't think many of the global institutions focus on how India can benefit from the global talent race that is marching ahead. I will like to end by saying that technology is enabling now both the distinction between manufacturing and services to get more blurred, and but that doesn't change the fact that India broke an iron law of development. Thank you. I'll end there. Dr. Niranjan.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ghani, for a very, very insightful presentation and just the wide sweep of issues which you covered while presenting your idea of a new growth model, which is more service-led than manufacturing-led for India. So may I invite Professor Nulkar to, as discussant, give his comments on the paper. And Gurdas, you have 10 minutes to make your points. And then perhaps I'll ask Ijaz Ghani whether he'd like to respond to some of your comments.
Sure, and definitely, because I have a couple of questions also, which I'm sure many of the participants would also have. So thank you, Dr. Ghani, for such an interesting exposition of the research which you have recently conducted. And it's really heartening to see that, the service sector-led growth is perhaps more resilient to global economic downturns than the goods-led export growth. I have a couple of observations here, and I'm just trying to build up on whatever you said, and especially starting with the point on spending on tertiary education, which is the highest spending today that we see in India. I think your arguments make perfect economic sense for investment in primary and secondary education, which has been highly ignored by the central government as well as the state governments today. Most of the new education which is coming up, with good quality education which is coming up, especially in the tier 1, tier 2 cities, is highly skewed towards the affluent society. But the way you put forth your arguments, which are all data backed, I think there is compelling evidence to that primary education investment will directly lead to a succession in economic growth in India. So I think that one point is something which is very important, and especially because your study also shows that the labor productivity in India is very high. I wanted to spend just a couple of minutes on talking about the nature of poverty in India. And we all know that the sectoral contribution of the agrarian economy in the Indian GDP is just about 16 to 17%, whereas the number of people involved in the agrarian sector amounts to nearly 55%. So the skew, the inequity in wealth and income distribution comes rather from the agrarian sector, which is perhaps quite far away from the services sector that we are just discussing. So my question to you would be, is there a way in which the service sector can support the agrarian, bolster the incomes of the agrarian sector? And one of the points which you made is absolutely valid for that, is the digital divide and the urban and rural digital divide. So definitely that is one thing against that. The second question which comes to my mind is, if we are growing less in terms of production, actual production of goods rather than services, is this actually going against the government agenda of being Atmanirbhar? Would we in the near future have to depend more on imports for goods? And wouldn't that pull down or wouldn't that increase our vulnerability towards global downturns? So I think these are the 2 or 3 questions which immediately come to my mind, if you would like to address them.
Should I?
Yes, please.
Okay. Professor Gurudas, these are excellent questions. I completely agree with you. But let me make an effort to elaborate on how I agree on all these 3 questions with you. First, on education. The data that India is spending 6 times more on tertiary education just helped us to understand that all the IITs and IIMs were behind the high-skilled service revolution in India. But that doesn't justify the low level of investments in education. Actually, we have also gathered evidence that the rate of return on education is much higher in India than the rate of return on education in Europe and USA. It's simple. When you invest more in primary education, and we have a youth bulge, and they become more skilled, they contribute more to growth. And because of the potential for higher growth, the investment has bigger payoffs. So there is no denying that we need to scale up investments in primary education and in physical infrastructure, because the rate of return is much higher in India given its youth bulge. Let me turn to your next question. The service sector led new growth model seems to be concentrated only in urban areas, but how will it help the rural areas, agriculture? Here, I think, India's urban and spatial development agenda is rapidly evolving. We have evidence that the manufacturing sector is started to move out from mega cities to tier 2 and tier 3 cities to remain cost competitive. No manufacturing enterprise will remain competitive in Bombay or Delhi. It's too expensive. So they're moving out. A similar transition will start in the services sector. But both of them will need scaling up infrastructure in tier 2 and tier 3 cities. It will require reducing the digital divide so rural people, also have access to it. And people surviving on agriculture can make a quick transition, or their children can move from being a labor force in the agriculture to joining other, better jobs and more productivity. On the self-sufficiency, one striking thing we found, let me give you empirical evidence. 70% of the jobs in India are in the informal sector, small enterprises. Only 30% of the jobs are in the formal sector. And we asked the question, empirically, where have the informal jobs grown? And we found that informal jobs in the tradable sector have grown much faster than informal jobs in the non-tradable sector. Every good today has a global supply chain, and they're outsourcing it. And the informal jobs in India are a good way to keep, use the global supply chain for large enterprises or enterprises abroad. So we should not overlook the fact that many more women and poor people in the informal sector have benefited a great deal from, in the tradable sector, from the outsourcing that's happening. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ghani, and the questions have flowed in. So I'll just take a few, and then depending on time, we can take more. But the first is question I want to put to you is from Dr. Amitav Malik, and it's really a big picture question that any future growth model will not be sustainable without robust climate resilience. So that's one. If you can just take a few I'll punch them up a bit. Ajay Phatak, his question is interesting because a lot of the services success is also because of labor arbitrage possibilities, and I think he's suggesting that the price of labor the manpower is now rising very rapidly. So would this make the local services market unviable? And Dr. Aditya Bhan asked that the allocation of investment between primary and secondary education, should it be market driven or should the state have a role to play?
Sorry.
Perhaps take a few more questions later.
Yeah, can you repeat the third question?
So you obviously spoken about upgrading the education system and the need for like human capital in this services model. So who will drive this allocation between primary and secondary education? What role should the market play and what role should the state play? I think that's the sense I got from the question.
Okay, I think these are great questions and a lot more work needs to be done. Whether the service-led growth or manufacturing-led growth is more climate-friendly and more sustainable. We have not yet examined this empirically, so I'll not be able to answer this question, straight away, which one is superior. On the second question, that the price of labor is rising in India, and this may harm the service-led growth. Yes and no, because rupee is also depreciated. I mean, I did mention that the US interest rates are going up, and whenever Fed, the central bank of USA, starts tightening their monetary policy, currencies in developing countries, including India, start depreciating. So that keeps the labor cost competitive. That's just one aspect. The other aspect is India has a youth bulge. So if somebody doesn't come there, 10 million more people will come who will do it. So I wouldn't really be worried so much about price of labor. I'll focus much more on whether the productivity growth is catching up. On the third question, who will invest and allocate more in education? That's a key challenging question. And we can draw a lesson from India's new growth model. India's new growth model, service-led growth model, blossomed because it didn't rely just on the government. It relied on public-private partnerships. I mean, the role of private sector was very critical. And even on infrastructure and telecom infrastructure, the public-private partnership projects have played a key role. So we can apply these lessons of success of public-private partnerships in the telecom infrastructure and scale it up on the education sector too. And I think, global development institutions, including my own ex-World Bank, will need to scale up investments in education because education has a much higher rate of return. You can even float India education bond and ask the diaspora to hold it or whoever wants to hold it, the education bond, which can be mobilized to scale up investments. So there are many instruments and tools we have besides the Ministry of Finance budget.
Thank you. There's a very interesting question from Professor Alvarez. So I'll just read it out to you. Not exactly, but the question he asks is that this interesting model will be inequality enhancing, although poverty reducing, with growth at its center. So he's asking the question of the long-term feasibility of this model, and there are 2 or 3 things he points out, like preconditions. One, accelerating growth is needed so that there is sufficient growth dividend for appropriate social policy and capacity building. 2, the tax multiplier for the services sector should not be significantly lower than that related to the manufacturing sector. And he says, the need for a strong political leadership that will keep a lid on potential socio-political strife that may arise due to inequality coupled with aspiration. So essentially, there's a broader political economy question here about this particular growth model, which may bring down poverty, but increase in the income gap between citizens.
I completely agree with what Abhay has mentioned, the role of growth dividend, the tax multiplier, and the political leadership. the growth dividend, will pay off in the long run, but there is no reason why the taxes on services should be lower than on manufacturing. It should be egalitarian. And we do need political commitment. The biggest investment, the driver of inclusive growth, would be if we can scale up investment in education and physical infrastructure. Then we have 200 million people who will be joining the labor force, who have the education and who can start their own enterprises, given the excellent infrastructure. So let's aim to scale up the investments in physical and human infrastructure, which is going to make growth much more inclusive.
There are a few questions which I want to bunch together, and essentially I think there are two big concerns in the audience. The first is essentially that I think it ties again with the cost of labor issue, that a lot of the Indian labor force is not skilled enough, so it's unemployable, as somebody has said in the question. That's one set of questions, that just are we going to hit a skills barrier? And the other is about, you mentioned the spatial distribution of this growth, and it's about regional development, balanced regional development, sort of growth of services outside the big metros. But I just want to add something to it that again brings us to the I think the question which Professor Pete also asked, one of the questions about the capacity of these tier 2 and tier 3 cities to host new companies, investments, to build themselves up. So if you could just speak a bit on both the skilling and the problems which could arise with the decentralization of the services spatially.
Okay, on skilling, we examined where did jobs grow in the manufacturing sector by looking at the NSS data. And we found that, and as I mentioned that earlier too, most of the jobs, less skilled jobs, exploded in the tradable sector, because the global supply chains enabled less skilled people to join the global supply chain and do little things, stitching, cleaning. A similar global outsourcing agenda can explode in the services sector. But I don't have the expertise. I wish the IT industry people will come up and say that, okay, there is role for the informal sector jobs to explode in the modern services sector too. On the spatial development agenda, I have no doubt that India's growth in the next 20 years will be driven by what happens in tier 2 and tier 3 cities, not in the mega cities. And the empirical evidence that we have gathered so far is the only thing that's holding back the growth in tier 2, tier 3 cities is lack of investments in physical infrastructure and education. If that can be scaled up, the quality of the local government will also scale up, and they'll become, we examined the question, what makes cities competitive? So we examined hundreds of cities in India, and we found that there's only one thing that matters, this investments in physical and human infrastructure. If that can be scaled up, it leads to growth in new enterprises. These new enterprises create more jobs, reduce poverty, and this becomes a virtuous circle which can lift millions out of poverty. So the only thing holding back is the lack of investments in physical and human infrastructure in tier 2, tier 3 cities.
So there are a few other questions which are slightly outside the scope of your paper, including on issues about sustainability, whether GDP captures, these issues. But I just, so I would ask them because you didn't directly deal with any of these issues. But I want to go back to just one last question from me. What Professor Nulkar said, that if you look at India's foreign trade pattern, right? We usually have a services surplus and a trade deficit, and merchandise trade deficit. And I think it's the point you really just want to reiterate and then ask you this question, that if we have this model where growth or employment is led by very high skilled services exports, and these people, you said they will consume and therefore lead to second round effects. But what if there's actual leakage? And there's some data which shows that this sort of consumption is actually expanding the trade deficit. Demand for mobile phones, foreign education, foreign holidays, televisions, etc. Now, this intersectoral balance, is it become so imbalanced that means, can India really ignore building up domestic manufacturing capacity? Means, forget about the skilling, etc., but just even in terms of its management of its trade with the rest of the world.
Okay, let me not overlook the sustainability and green growth question, because we did examine this. We picked up millions of enterprises from the ASI NSS data. The survey tells us, that these enterprises, how much labor they used and how much energy they consume and how much they produce. So we asked the question, how efficient are they in their energy usage? And what we found was that overall energy efficiency has improved in India, the amount of energy being used. And if you're more energy efficient, you'll have less pollution. But what is more concerning is that in tier 2, tier 3 cities, where the industries are moving, because the manufacturing sector is de-urbanizing, they're moving from mega cities to tier 2, tier 3 cities. Their energy efficiency did not improve. It only improved in mega cities. And we asked, what's happening? In tier 2, tier 3 cities, they don't have access to reliable energy. So they put up their own power plants. And these power plants, are not highly efficient, so create more pollution. So the agenda for green growth is to scale up infrastructure in tier 2, tier 3 cities. So green growth and growth, is the same thing, because it contributes to more higher growth. On the trade agenda, let me step back. I think your question about sectoral balance across sectors is an important one. But I wouldn't really get hung up on which sector is superior. I'll focus on whether the reallocation of labor and capital across sectors will increase growth. That's the key thing. So if we can enable more efficient allocation of labor, capital, and land between agriculture, manufacturing, and services, India's growth will, go higher than double-digit growth rate. Let me take the liberty of, we examined this question, but we also asked the question, which factor of production is most distorted in India? So we picked up again billions of enterprises from ASI NSS survey. And these surveys asked the question, each enterprise, how much of labor, land, and capital they have used. And we asked the question, which factor is more efficient? Factor market. And we found that land markets are most distorted. Then the labor market is more efficient than capital market. So land markets are highly distorted. I think this agenda also ties up with the questions that were being raised on tier 2, tier 3 cities. But the overall on, whether India should, rely more on self-reliance or more on trade. Again, we're posing many questions of either or. I think, we need to take a dynamic approach. If there is a little bit of benefit, grab it. There are 200 million people waiting for jobs.
Thank you. Just one last question has come in right now, and I think it's interesting enough to, we're almost out of time. The question is, do you see any competition from other countries for India in the new growth model? In the sense that, are there any other countries which could sort of push us out in this service-led growth story?
Yes. Many African countries, including Kenya, Ethiopia, their growth path is also very similar to India. There, the services are exploding compared to the manufacturing sector in what we call the other latecomers to development. They also have a youth bulge. So yes, there will be competition. But India has the advantage of a well-established global diaspora network and many universities. But to answer your question simply, yes, there is. And these latecomers to development from Africa are following the same growth path model that India has followed.
We're out of time now, so thank you very much, Dr. Ijaz Ghani, for your presentation, for all the very incisive and insightful answers to the questions, and also to Professor Gurudas Nulkar for his very, very insightful comments on your paper. Abhay, I'm handing it back to you.
Thank you very much, Niranjan. And thank you, Dr. Ghani, for a fascinating spotlight on growth through services in India, which you say has been miraculous. And your data and your perspectives and your insights really make us think. You spoke of how India's growth over the past decades has been through services and China's through manufacturing. And you very well pointed out that what Americans want is not food exports, but they want digital services. And the enormous contribution of IT and IT-enabled services to India's economic growth. You said that the prospects for future growth in services exports is very bright, and the service sector has contributed more to poverty reduction than the manufacturing sector. We had excellent anchoring and the questions brought out by Niranjan. Professor Nulkar spoke of the need for greater investment in primary and secondary education in view of our youth bulge. And as you said, there is no denying that we have to scale up the investments in primary and secondary education if we want to benefit further from our services sector. This discussion touched upon the issues of long-term feasibility of this model, the state of the Indian labor force with the large section of unskilled labor, and the very important point of the tier 2 and tier 3 cities where the future growth is going to happen in a big way. And what they need is physical infrastructure and education. Your paper and this discussion has been extremely valuable with all these pointers in place. And I wish to thank you, Niranjan and Dr. Nulkar, and the members of our audience for the many questions that came in. With this, I would like to mention our next event, which is the 9th lecture in the India and the World's Great Religion series, which is happening tomorrow. The subject is Sikhism, the travels and teachings of Guru Nanak, and the speaker is Ambassador Navtej Sarna, former Indian ambassador to Israel and United States, and the former High Commissioner to UK. And the chairperson for this event is Shri Srinivas Rao Sohni, former Secretary to the President of India and Senior Advisor to the President of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. Mr. Sohni is a member of PIC. The link and the details will be available on our website, puneinternationalcenter.org. You are most welcome to join us. And once again, I wish to thank our speakers. I wish to thank our guest, Dr. Aizaz Ghani, who is also speaking tomorrow at a Thai event. So Thai will definitely send their link and also make it available on YouTube. So he has a talk there tomorrow evening. So thank you very much once again and have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much.